The train rattled across the endless Kansas plains, its steel wheels screaming against the rails as hundreds of weary German soldiers stared out through narrow windows. Just weeks earlier, they had been fighting for what they believed was an unbeatable Reich. Propaganda had promised them victory, painting America as weak, decadent, and unprepared for a long war. But now, as prisoners thousands of miles from home, they were about to discover just how wrong they had been. They expected ruins. They expected ration lines, crumbling factories, and cities on the brink of collapse. That was the image of America they had been fed for years. Yet as the countryside unfolded before them, they saw something entirely different. Sprawling farmland stretching beyond the horizon, endless fields of wheat and corn, and towns untouched by bombs or hunger. It looked like a nation untouched by war, a nation thriving. When the trains finally stopped and the German POWs stepped onto American soil, they braced for punishment. They imagined crude stockades, meager rations, and brutal guards. Instead, what greeted them left them silent and confused. The prison camps didn't look like prisons at all. They looked like small, organized cities. Neatly built barracks stood in long rows, connected by paved roads. There were mess halls, recreation fields, libraries, and even movie theaters. It was nothing like what they had expected, and for many, this was their first sign that everything they thought they knew about America was wrong. Inside the camps, trucks arrived every single day loaded with supplies: food, medicine, fuel, clothing, books, sports equipment. An endless stream of resources flowed effortlessly into the compounds. German soldiers who had fought on empty stomachs, surviving on black bread and turnip soup, now watched their captors throw away half-eaten sandwiches and pour out untouched coffee without a second thought. Back in Germany, they had been told Americans were soft, obsessed with comfort, unwilling to endure hardship. But here, they saw something far more dangerous than softness: effortless power. America was fighting wars on two fronts, across two oceans, and still had enough surplus to treat its prisoners better than Germany could treat its own citizens. Slowly, whispers began to spread among the prisoners. If America could live like this in wartime, how strong were they really? The truth revealed itself in pieces. Some POWs read American newspapers distributed in the camps. Others overheard guards talking about production figures. Bit by bit, they pieced together a picture that left them stunned. Factories that once built cars were now turning out tanks and jeeps by the thousands. Shipyards on the coasts launched Liberty cargo ships faster than German U-boats could sink them, almost 3 ships every single day. In California, Boeing churned out bombers at a pace that defied belief. Airplane plants were producing P-51 Mustangs, B-17 Flying Fortresses, and B-29 Superfortresses by the hundreds each month. Between 1942 and 1945, the United States produced 297,000 aircraft, 88,000 tanks, 2.6 million machine guns, and 2,700 Liberty ships. When German officers inside the camp saw these numbers, many fell silent. One prisoner later admitted, "I believed our industry was unmatched, but when I saw how easily they built ships, planes, and tanks, and still fed us better than we ate at home, I knew Germany was doomed." For many, the shock wasn't just in the scale of America's production, but in its abundance. POWs who had grown up in a culture of scarcity were eating meals in U.S. camps that seemed unthinkable in wartime Europe. Soft white bread, real butter, fresh vegetables, meat with every dinner, and hot coffee every morning. This forced them to confront a painful truth. Their leaders had told them America was collapsing under its own weight. Yet here, they saw a country so powerful, so efficient, that it could build tanks, bombers, and ships faster than Germany could destroy them, while feeding its enemies like honored guests. At night, Under the dim lights of the barracks, German officers whispered quietly among themselves. They believed courage and sacrifice would win wars. But here, they saw something far greater. Production had become a weapon. America had industrialized victory. For many of these men, the moment they stepped into those camps was the moment they realized the war was already lost.
Inside the camps, the shock deepened with every passing day. These men had entered captivity expecting hardship, hunger, and humiliation. Instead, they found organization, efficiency, and dignity, a world completely alien to what they had been taught. In Germany, food had become a luxury. Families survived on ration cards. Black bread, stretched with sawdust, watery turnip soup, and bitter ersatz coffee were the norm. But in the American camps, prisoners sat down to meals that seemed impossible in wartime. Plates filled with fresh vegetables, soft white bread, meat almost every day, and butter spread thickly without guilt. For many, it was a revelation and a humiliation. The Reich had promised strength, yet here they were, eating better as prisoners of war in America than their families ate back home. At first, some refused the food, convinced it must be a trick or propaganda. They whispered that the meat might be poisoned or that the soft bread hid some psychological game. But hunger always wins, and eventually they gave in. One bite was enough to shatter their suspicions. Every meal, every discarded sandwich, every truckload of supplies became a reminder of something far larger. America's resources seemed endless. They had been told that American society was decadent, lazy, incapable of fighting a prolonged war. Nazi propaganda painted the U.S. as a divided, weak nation on the brink of collapse. But here on American soil, they saw reality for themselves, and it terrified them. This was not weakness. This was power, a kind of power they had never imagined. It wasn't just the food, it was everything. Every day, convoys of trucks rolled through the gates, delivering fuel, medicine, clothes, books, even sports equipment. American guards moved with a casual confidence, unbothered by shortages or rations. To the German prisoners, it was staggering. In Germany, every scrap of string, every rusted nail, every spoonful of sugar was saved and reused. In America, they watched abundance treated as ordinary. For a society raised on sacrifice, scarcity, and slogans about honor, this was almost incomprehensible. Some prisoners began keeping secret notebooks, recording every detail they observed: how the supply chains worked, how food distribution was organized, how materials flowed into the camps like clockwork. Many believed this information might someday be useful to rebuild Germany after the war. But deep down, they understood what these routines really meant. They were fighting an enemy whose strength came not from slogans, but from systems. At night, the barracks filled with quiet conversations. Some still clung to hope, repeating that German courage and fighting spirit would prevail in the end. Others stared silently into the darkness, replaying what they had seen: the trucks, the factories, the trains, the endless supplies, and realizing the truth. Germany's willpower couldn't defeat America's production power. One officer later confessed in his memoirs, "We believed we were the world's strongest nation, but when I saw how easily America fed us, clothed us, and supplied its armies, I understood. We had already lost. We just hadn't admitted it yet." The longer they stayed in captivity, the clearer the truth became. Every day, German prisoners witnessed logistical power on a scale they had never imagined. They watched supply convoys roll into the camps like clockwork, their trucks stacked high with food, fuel, medicine, tools, and clothing. And this wasn't just for them. This was happening everywhere, every day, across an entire continent. Word spread quickly among the prisoners. America wasn't just fighting one war. It was fighting two full-scale wars across Europe and the Pacific, and still seemed untouched. Slowly, bits of information trickled into the camps.
Newspapers, overheard conversations, and occasional American broadcasts revealed staggering figures. Factories that once built cars had been converted overnight into war machines. Assembly lines that once turned out sedans were now producing tanks, jeeps, and half-tracks by the tens of thousands. Shipyards along the coasts launched Liberty cargo ships at an impossible pace, almost 3 ships a day, faster than German U-boats could sink them. Airplane plants in California, Washington, and Texas produced bombers and fighters faster than anyone thought possible. Entire forests of P-51 Mustangs, B-17 Flying Fortresses, and B-29 Superfortresses rolled out of hangars month after month. The numbers defied belief. 297,000 aircraft built between 1942 and 1945, 88,000 tanks, 2.6 million machine guns, 2,700 Liberty ships. For the German prisoners, these numbers were unthinkable. Back home, their own factories struggled just to keep pace. Bombed cities, resource shortages, and endless rationing had crippled production. But here, on the other side of the ocean, America was building more weapons, more vehicles, and more planes than the entire Axis combined. One German Luftwaffe officer later admitted, "When I read the figures, I thought they were propaganda, but then I saw them in motion. The endless convoys, the full warehouses, the food thrown away without thought, and I understood. Germany had no chance. We had been fighting a giant while pretending he was small." And yet, perhaps the most crushing revelation wasn't in the production numbers. It was in what they saw around them. America could build hundreds of bombers in a week, supply armies across 2 oceans, and still feed its prisoners better than German civilians ate at home. Germany had gambled everything on speed, courage, and ideology. America had bet on industrial depth, and it was winning without breaking a sweat. For many German POWs, this was the moment reality finally sunk in. They had not just lost the war. They had lost it long before they ever set foot on American soil. For the German prisoners, the shock didn't end with factories and numbers. What truly shattered them was seeing how ordinary Americans lived while their homeland burned. Back home, entire cities lay in ruins. Hamburg, Cologne, Dresden, reduced to rubble and ash. Families queued for hours to get scraps of bread. Coffee was a rare luxury, butter almost unheard of, and meat reserved for the elite. Yet here, in the heart of America, even the simplest families seemed to live in comfort. From the windows of their trains and work details, the POWs saw clean houses, new cars, and fields overflowing with crops. They watched children playing baseball in sunlit parks, their laughter carrying through the warm air. They passed diners where civilians sat eating hamburgers, steaks, and slices of pie, as if the war barely existed. At first, many believed it was staged, another act of propaganda designed to break their morale. But as days turned into weeks and weeks into months, the truth became undeniable. This wasn't a show. This was America. Even within the prison camps, the differences were stark. The barracks were clean and heated. There were recreation fields, libraries, and even movie screenings. Red Cross inspections ensured that prisoners were treated according to the Geneva Convention. German POWs were even allowed to send letters home and receive packages, privileges many German-run camps never offered Allied prisoners. For young soldiers raised on Nazi propaganda, it was a devastating contradiction. They had been taught America was a fractured, decadent society in decline. Yet here, they saw a country overflowing with confidence and optimism. They began to notice something else, too. American society looked different from theirs in ways they had never imagined possible. Women worked in factories, drove trucks, ran offices, and even served in positions of authority. African Americans, Mexican Americans, and immigrants from dozens of nations worked side by side in fields and factories, contributing to the war effort. This level of diversity and integration was foreign to them.
completely at odds with the rigid racial hierarchies they had been raised to believe were natural. For some, this was deeply unsettling. For others, it was eye-opening. One prisoner later wrote, "We had been told America was weak because it was divided. But standing there, watching men and women of every background working together, I realized something frightening. It was not their weakness, it was their strength." At night, the barracks grew quiet. Men who had once spoken with pride about Hitler's promises now whispered about the world they had discovered behind enemy lines. Some clung to their beliefs, unwilling to accept the truth. Others, especially the younger soldiers, began questioning everything they thought they knew. They started to see America not as a collapsing empire, but as an unstoppable machine powered by unity and abundance. For many, this realization came with an unspoken grief. They understood that Germany's defeat wasn't just probable, it was inevitable.
By 1945, reality had settled over the camps like an unshakable weight. News filtered in through American newspapers, Red Cross bulletins, and guarded conversations overheard by prisoners. Cities like Berlin, Hamburg, and Cologne were being reduced to rubble. Supply lines had collapsed. Oil reserves were gone. Even the Luftwaffe, once Germany's pride, was being dismantled in the skies by swarms of American bombers. Inside the camps, the German prisoners connected the dots. The trucks filled with endless supplies, the factories producing without pause, the airfields launching new fleets of aircraft daily. They understood now what it meant. Germany had been defeated long before Berlin fell. For some, the acceptance came slowly, eroded day by what they saw around them. For others, it hit like a hammer the first time they saw hundreds of B-17 bombers soaring overhead in perfect formation, knowing that somewhere thousands more were waiting on the ground. One officer later described the moment of realization in his diary. "We thought we were warriors fighting equals, but we were fighting a giant, and the giant had not even broken a sweat." And yet, amid the despair, there was something unexpected, a growing admiration for the very nation they had been taught to hate. They saw that American strength did not come from cruelty, but from organization, unity, and optimism. They watched a society where individuals debated politics openly, where newspapers criticized leaders freely, and where innovation was encouraged rather than feared. To men raised in an authoritarian system, this was unthinkable, and yet they couldn't deny what they were seeing. America's democracy was not a weakness, it was its greatest weapon. As Germany's defeat became certain, conversations inside the barracks changed. There was less talk of Hitler, less clinging to old slogans, and more quiet reflection on what had gone wrong. Some wondered what kind of Germany would rise from the ashes. Others began to dream of building a society modeled at least in part on what they had witnessed in America. When the war finally ended in May 1945, the mood inside the camps was strange and heavy. There was relief that the killing had stopped, grief for the homes and families they had lost, and an overwhelming sense of uncertainty about what awaited them back in a shattered Germany. Some prisoners carried with them letters from American guards, small gifts from local families, and even notebooks filled with ideas about agriculture, education, and industry, lessons they had quietly gathered during their captivity. For many, the greatest shock of all was realizing that their time as prisoners had transformed them. They had arrived believing in propaganda. They left believing in possibility. Years later, historians would note something remarkable. German POWs who had spent time in the United States were more likely to embrace democratic values, participate in rebuilding institutions, and resist authoritarianism in post-war Germany. For them, captivity had not just been a defeat, it had been an education. And it all began the moment they stepped off those trains in 1943 and realized that America's unstoppable industrial power had already decided the outcome of the war.
If you want to uncover more untold World War II stories, subscribe now and tell us in the comments what shocked you most about America's power during the war.